The mid-9th to 15th century arrival of the Portuguese along the West African coast was not the principal reason for reorientation of power in the region, as that process had actually begun at least 50 years prior. In the aftermath of Mansa Suleiman's reign, Mali faltered due to the succession disputes, in tandem with a central administrative apparatus challenged by a sprawling territory expanse. Growing Malian weaknesses encouraged the rise of alternative political formations, and though the Mali would continue well into the 11th and 17th century, it would do so in diminished form, losing control over vital spaces of commercial and cultural exchange in both the Senegal and Niger valleys. The Middle Niger is the focus of what follows. We're dawned at polity that, though tethered to the Malian antidote is important ways, nonetheless forged a model of state power never before witnessed here. The onset of Songhay was in fact a re-emergence, and that it recentered the ancient town of Galle, the capital of the novel experiment. Inheriting the mantle of Mali, Songhay would undertake important innovations in meeting the demands of intercontinental commerce, ethnic diversity, and Islamic expansion. By the way of serial effort of experimentation and a regime range, Songhay boldly attempted the realization of pluralist society fully reflective of its multiple constituencies, an approach premised on a new theory of governance in which spheres of influence were distributed to shareholders as self-organized groupings of communities, a policy made evident and articulated through practice and convention. Spheres with the highest levels of influence were those of the mosque and a state of intersecting with each other as well as with other spaces largely defined by ethnic and occupational interests. Informed by both local practice and international engagement, Songhay would eventually achieve a remarkable social compact by which new levels of mutual respect and tolerance were reached, and through which Songhay came to be characterized. In this way, it distinguished itself from its Malian predecessor, for although inclusive of a non-Mandan element, the Malian Empire was the first and foremost of Mandi operation, in which the Mande sought to control all levels of political, social, and cultural power, something even Mansa Musa sought to consolidate through the indigenization program. In contrast, Songhay would evolve differently, becoming a much more ethnically heterogeneous society in which allegiance to the state transcends loyalties to clan, culture, and with its leadership becoming much more diverse. But the turn away from Mali to Imperial Songhay involves once again the engagement with a different source base. Though consulted in previous chapters, the external written Arabic sources in conjunction with archaeological and linguistic data upon which knowledge of the early Sahel and Imperial Mali heavily depends, is of tertiary importance for Imperial Songhay, as little of it pertains to the 9th, 15th, and the 10th, 16th centuries. Likewise, internal oral materials of the kind devoted to Sanjata are far less significance or centrality. In their place are materials written in Arabic during the period of Imperial Songhay and at its fall in 999, really 1591. As such, these records represent an entirely new development in West Africa, as the first written documentation intentionally created to record its history. Eyewitness accounts of foreigners combined with records from Morocco helped to round out a picture, with ethnographic research gathered since the 13th, 19th century extrapolated at considerable risk for social and cultural implications. As a result, Imperial Songhai's history very much rests on a penned ingenuity. Until this reconstruction of Songhay, so much of what is known about West Africa is based on external sources and foreign traveler reports, while oral tradition tends to be highly stylized and parochial in temporal scope and concerns, preoccupied with origins and foundational relationships. The latter is also true of Imperial Songhay, for which the oral record provides an alternative, often countervailing perspective more impressionated than declarative. To be sure, oral traditions are included in the written histories of the 10th, 16th, and the 11th, 17th centuries, but their appropriation represents a dramatic shift in West African process of memorization. While the approach to recalling the past changed with Imperial Songhay, is far from obvious as written had been utilized in the region for centuries in both the Arabic and Tefning or Tamashite beginning their writings in the 5th century. So is the matter of new technology. The primary sources for the period remains Abd al-Raham, Abib Allah, Imram al-Sadis, Tariq al-Sudan, and Tariq al-Fattāsh, began by the Qadi judge and the fiqh jurist Muhammad Qadi al-Hajj al-Mutawakkil Qadi al-Kumar al-Wakari, otherwise known as Muhammad B. Qadi al-Hajj al-Mutawakkil Allah, and completed by his grandson Ibn al-Makhtar. There is also an anonymous untitled work between 1657 and 1669 and published as a second appendix to the French translation of the Tariq al-Fattāsh and Notice History. These are supplemented by extraordinary scholarship of Ahmad Baba, in particular his Miraj el-Sa'id, the Ladder of Ascent, and the Kafayate el-Matar li Marif Man Lasir Filin Diba, and abridged of his Nail el-Abtib bi Tertris el-Dabjib, which is the founder of the Martyrs of Ibn Farab's el-Dabjib el-Mahabet fi Ayan el-Umar el-Mahab, together with the writings of Muhammad ibn al-Bib al-Karim al-Majali, the recordings of Leo Africanus, and the Moroccan correspondence that mostly pertains to the post-1591 period, forged grounding the backgrounds and interests of principal works authors, greatly facilitated the analysis while providing insight into innovation of internal written record. Songhay was the last of the great empires of the Western Sudan. The period of his greatness was last just over a century, will be dealt with in another. However, here we are concerned with the Songhay state from its earlier days to the reign of Sani Ali, who turned into an empire, and with the effect of the rise of Songhay on the disintegration of Mali. The Songhay are now spread in a large arc along the Niger from Dindi in the east to Lake Debo in the south near Timbuktu to the west. There are also Songhay communities in Mopti and Jin. In the Humbari Mountains inside the Niger Bend are to be found the only landlocked, non-riverine Songhay people. The Niger played a decisive role not only in the dispersion of the Songhay, but also in the expansion of their imperial dominions when the empire became dominant in the Sudan. Their dependence on a watercourse for expansion is best illustrated by the plan of Sani Ali to dig a canal from Ras Al-Ma to Alata in order to conquer his town of Sahel. The fleet was most important in the military exploits of the Songhay. This is explained by the fact that a dominant element among the Songhay were the Sorku fishermen of the Niger, the complementary elements which together with the Sokor formed the heterogeneous people, were the Gao hunters and the doe farmers. The Sokor navigated up the river from Dindi and reached the region of Benish, north of Tilbury, where they found hippopotami in abundance. Mobile and warlike people, the Sokor became not only masters of the water, but also rulers of the farmers, owners of the earth, who lived in the region of Benin. There they were joined by hunters and a town by the name of Kukia, developed as the capital of Songhay Nation. In this region, the Niger flows a red country, an extension of the Sahara inhabited by the Berber nomads. The contact between the Berber and the Songhay introduced the latter to the trans-Saharan trade and stimulated among them a more cohesive political organization. This may be inferred from the traditions about the Dai, the first Songhay dynasty. The founder of this dynasty, a stranger, was recognized as a sovereign by the Songhay after he had killed a fish dragon worshipped by the Songhay people, whom were subjected to its stringent laws. The myth of the dragon killer becoming a ruler and widespread in West Africa. It may represent a departure from a society dominated by an oracle priest to that ruled by chiefs. Yet the new Songhay chiefs were by no means circular, as magic played an important role in their authority. It was probably in the 8th century that a new town, Gao, developed north of Kikuyu as a terminus for a trans-Saharan trail. Through this trade, the kingdom of Songhay became known to the Arabs by the name of the Kawkaw, which may refer to the Gao-Kikuyu complex. It is likely that with the growing importance of Gao as a commercial entrepot, the Daya rulers moved there but retained Kikuyu as the ancestral traditional capital where the ceremonial investiture of the kings took place. Close commercial relations between Kawkaw and the Kharijite state at Tahart in western Algeria developed soon after the establishment of a latter in the late 8th century. In 874, the famous Kharijite revolution by Abu Yazid was born in the Kawkaw, where his father was a trader. Kawkaw is mentioned by El-Khwarizmi, who died in 846, 847, and in 872. It was described by El-Yaqabu as the most powerful kingdom in the Sudan, with many vassals, chiefs paying tribute. In 985, the Egyptian author El-Mahalabi described Kawkaw as divided into two towns on both sides of the Niger. On the right bank facing the desert was the traders' town, and on the other bank was the royal town. The king of Kawkaw was then Muslim. His Islamization was a result of influence of the Muslim traders resident in Kawkaw. He was probably the first important Sudanese ruler to adopt Islam, preceding even Taqwa. Islam, however, was confined to the court, and even in it seems to have been superficial because al-Bukhari describes a Muslim king hedged by traditional non-Muslim ceremonial customs, ruling over a pagan population. Royal steles discovered near Gao in 1939 have epithets calling kings and other members of the royal family by their Arabic names, which they had beside their traditional ones. The steles are dated back to 1100 and 1256, and some of these are carved on marble, the work of Andalusian sculptors. This suggests some contact between the Muslim kings of Gao and Spain. Lineages and clans represent the kinship system, and villages and districts represent the territorial setting from the basis of social political structure of societies in Western Sudan. Above this level, one should take account of the ethnic groups, of which the principal ones, Sanike, Malinke, Bambara, Songhay, Tukula, etc., may be described as nations. Each of these nations had in common language, history, customs, religion, and territory. Territory, however, should be redefined for each period in the history of a nation. A nation is formed by different clans, which fall into different categories of status: nobles, freedmen, castsmen, serfs, and slaves. The political history is generally that of the noble clans, and the process of state building is that of one noble clan asserting its authority over other groups and over the territories they occupy. The dominant clan can then become the wealthiest by drawing from the resources of its subjects. There was no single pattern, and some examples of state building have already been given above in the account of the political history. Petty states or chiefdoms may be limited to a few villages or a district. Their numbers have always been legion, but though these form the basis for more elaborate forms of political organization, historical evidence about them is scanty. Geographers, travelers, historians were concerned more with the few great kingdoms or empires. These may cautiously be called national states. Ghana, for example, was a Sanike state. Its rulers were Sanike, and its dominions covered most of the country inhabited by the Songhay and little, if any, of the territories of other groups. Mali, on the other hand, ruled also over alien groups other than the Malinke, but its national character is revealed both at the dawn of its history and towards its end. By mobilizing the resources of the Malinke, Mali emerged as a dominant power, and then its government proved too weak to hold empire together, and it contracted back to the Malinke national territory. For the later period of Al-Sadi's left a description of the organization of Mali. It was divided into 3 provinces, and each of these was divided into smaller chieftaincies. The latter may have been local Malinke chieftaincies, which had been united under the Keita rulers to form the nucleus of the Mali Empire. In the conquered territories, Mali, like the other Sudanese empires, tended to retain the local rulers. Sons of the vassal kings were held at the court in Ghana or Mali, undoubtedly as hostages. Governors or commissioners were appointed over the local rulers and were responsible for the central government. They were recruited from members of the ruling family or from among the royal slaves. Slaves and serfs were of prime importance in the structure of the states in the economic, military, administrative, and political spheres. In the Western Sudan, there was no shortage of land, and the production depended on the availability of manpower. Lands cultivated by serfs or slaves could supply agricultural products for the chiefs to maintain their courts, their administrations, and their armies. The crown was the biggest owner of slave settlements, but other citizens also derived income from such settlements. This institution was inherited by Songhay from Mali, and it is likely that the Mali, as in Songhay, the king gave slave villages as gifts to his favorites. Slaves also rendered services attending the ruler or looking after his horses. Slaves were the core of the army as bowmen. A small kingdom had to mobilize and the citizens to form an army, but an empire with heavy military commitments needed a standing army. As the empire grew stronger, its rulers could obtain more slaves. As part of these were taken to the army, the cavalry. The striking force of the Sudanese army was that of the freemen, whose commanders were given estates and generous gifts from the king to win their loyalty. Horses were very expensive in the Sudan, and most were imported, first by Berbers and later by the Portuguese. The sources, Arabic and Portuguese, say that the horses were brought in exchange for slaves. The personal loyalty of slaves or freed slaves to the ruler made them a good choice for responsible posts in the provincial administration and court. At least some of the provincial governors in Mali were slaves, as was the comptroller of the commercial town of Walata, the Mansadayo royal slave. Slaves were prominent at court. They intervened in conflicts within the royal family and were among the kingmakers. When troubles weakened the legitimate dynasty, members of this group seized the throne, as did Sukari, the freed slave, and Sendinka, whose title may have been that of Sendiji, chief des Echa. The recorded history of Mali in the 13th and 14th century shows that during the reign of the powerful kings, the empire proposed while it was shaken to its foundations when the weak kings were on the throne. This indicates the importance of kings' personal role in the running of the government. This is supported by Batuti, who recorded the personal interventions of Mansa Suleiman in punishing the comptroller of Walata for abusing his office, and by El Drisi, who describes this daily inspection of the capital of the king in Ghana. The monarchies of the Sudanese kingdoms and empires had their origins in the office of the head of the clan and the chief of the small chieftaincy, and both of these circular authority had been combined with religious priesthood. But it appears that as they developed into monarchies, the sacred element was emphasized. Indeed, elements of divine kingship may be traced in these monarchies. The best description are from Canaan, which is outside of the scope of this perspective. However, Kalkal by al-Bukhari has stated, "No one is free to go about their royal town until he, the king, has finished his repast, the remnants of which are thrown into the Nile. Al-Bakir's description of the burial of the king of Ghana carries similar evidence. The audience of the king, both in Ghana and Mali, is described in much detail, and it is full of ceremonial customs. People approach the monarch prostrating, rolling on the ground, and putting dust on their heads, and no one is allowed to sneeze in the presence of the king. The king did not speak directly with his people, but only through linguists. The king was above the people, but this gave him no license to act brutally, as the case of deposed Khalifa proves. In other kingdoms, even dynasties were overthrown by Mali, in spite of continuous troubles and conflicts at the court, and occasional interventions by outsiders. The sanctity of the prestige of the Keita dynasty ensured the ultimate return of the throne to one of its members. The same dynasty ruled Mali for at least 4 centuries, is recorded here. Of all the subjects related to the early history of the Western Sudan, trade is the best documented. Information reached the Muslim world along trade routes carried by the traders who frequent the Sudan. These traders communicated mainly with other traders, both foreign and local, and their main interest was to collect whatever information was available on the economic resources of the country and on the prospects of trade. Here we will only be able to deal briefly with this subject, for more detail will come at a later time. However, most of the information that we have is collected and analyzed. All the documents are in regard to sources related to Arabic and Portuguese. Gold was the most important staple in this trade, and until the discovery of America, the Sudan was the principal source of gold, both for Muslim world and Europe. It is significant that, though much was known about the trade in general, little reliable information was available to the Arabs about the gold fields themselves. Common among Arab geographers is the description of the gold growing in the Sudan like carrots. The Sudanese chiefs and traders tried to keep the sources of gold secret from the foreign North African traders. Indeed, these Sudanese themselves had uneasy relations with the people of the gold-producing countries. This is well illustrated by the peculiar method of barter known as the silent trade. These traders laid down their merchandise, mainly salt, on the bank of a river and retreated. Then the local people came with their gold, laid some of it against each pile of goods, and withdrew. The traders then came back, and if satisfied with the amount of gold, they took it. As soon as they had disappeared, the local people came back to collect the merchandise they bought with their gold. Though this kind of trade relation may not have been general, it does indicate the reluctance of the local masters of their gold fields to come into direct contact with the more sophisticated Sudanese traders. That they came out of awe was because of their great need for salt. The Sudanese traders and chiefs had to respect the customs of these masters of the gold, for it was considered that only through the ritual association of the local people with the gold-bearing country did the land yield the precious metal. Mansa Musa related in Egypt that whenever he had tried to impose Islam on the people of the gold-bearing country, the gold diminished. He therefore left them on their own and was satisfied with the income he gained from controlling the gold through trade in his dominions. These people resisted not only Islam, but probably also central authority. It is likely the great empires of the Sudan did not rule the gold-bearing regions, but held them as exclusive spheres of influence. Following the scanty contemporary evidence and the recent information furnished by travelers and geologists, it is now possible to suggest 3 main gold fields, besides some of the less important, which supplied gold from the trans-Saharan trade. The earliest and most northern were the gold fields of Bambouk, which were exploited at the time of Ghana. In about the 12th century, the gold fields of Baru and Upper Niger gained importance. These gold fields contributed to the emergence of Mali, which controlled the routes approaching Baru. About the 14th century, rich new fields, far as the Akan Forest, began to feed the trans-Saharan trade, with Jin as the starting point of the southward routes to the region. Gold was extracted as dust and nuggets, and in this form it reached the trading centers of the Sahel. It was prepared for transport across the Sahara in places like Ouagadougou and Tadmeka. but was turned into coins only at the other end of the desert at places such as Sijamasa and Wagala. Some people in Western Sudan, those near the gold fields, were ready to pay an equivalent measure of gold for salt. This account of the ready to pay an equivalent measure of gold and salt takes place with Arabic sources, illustrates the great need for salt. Maritime salt was unattainable for distribution over the vast and remote areas in the humid climate of the Sudan. On the other hand, the salt bars extracted from the mines in the Sahara were dry and solid enough to be carried unsploit over long distances. The salt of Awil, near the coast of southern Mauritania, was sent by boats up to Senegal and distributed in the countries on both sides of the river. This mine was only of local importance compared with the mine of Tagaza on the route of Sijamasa to Ghana. The salt bars carried on camels across the Sahara to the centers in the Sahel were taken, whole or broken into pieces by the Sudanese traders to be distributed along the routes leading ultimately to the gold fields. These traders were mainly Sanike, who through their contact with the North African traders became Muslim. They are all called in Arabic sources Wangara, a name is still current in West Africa. Among the Malinke, the Sudanese traders are better known as Daula, a name in which became a synonym of Muslim trader. The Wangara were interior traders carrying their merchandise on asses, bullocks, porters, or even their own heads. Wangara communities developed along the routes to form a widespread network of trading and family relations. Travelers of the 19th century left vivid description of the Wangara, but it is likely that the scene had not much changed because Bakari account of the routes and the centers between Ghana and the goldfields tells a similar story. In a town like Jin, Sudanese traders were responsible for even more important transactions as agents of the trans-Saharan trade. They distributed the imported goods to retailers, the itinerant traders, and collected from them goods destined to export northwards. The same is true, but mainly in later periods, for other internal commercial centers. During the period where we are considering, the big traders in the centers of the Sahel were mostly North Africans, Berbers, and Arabs. The trade which bridged the two shores of the huge desert was very elaborate. This is well illustrated by a story of one firm, that of the Makari brothers in the 14th century. These five brothers from Telpsin were engaged in a prosperous trans-Saharan trade. They started by reorganizing the route, Seljamasa, Tangaza, and Walata, by digging wells, maintaining them, and by supplying guides to caravans. Two of them brothers stayed at Telpsin, where they obtained goods for the Sudan. One brother settled in Samasa, where he could obtain information about markets and prices both in the north and in the Sudan. He could therefore regulate the flow of goods to obtain maximum profits. The other two brothers lived in Walata, where they distributed the goods received from the north to local intermediate traders and collected from them goods to be sent in caravans to the brothers in the north. The brothers of Walata maintained good relations with the authorities of Mali, who encouraged their trading activities throughout the country. See, it was this kind of hospitality accorded to the North African traders by the Sudanese governments is recorded also in contemporary Arabic sources. We have already referred to the traders' wards at the capital of Ghana and Gayo. There, the foreign traders lived in somewhat secluded life, but at the capital of Mali, these foreigners became more closely involved in the life of the country because Islam, which had formerly divided the foreigners from the local people, now united them as brethren in faith. Batouti found Moroccan compatriots in all the important towns. His Moroccan host at the capital of Mali was married to the king's cousin and maintained close relations with the court. Batouti mentions among the virtues of the people of Mali that they did not touch the property left by a foreigner who died in their country. It was kept with one of his compatriots until recovered by the legitimate hire. Gold and salt were the two principal goods in trade. But as trade developed, more goods were added to the list, both for export and import. Among the imported goods were horses, clothes, all kinds of copper, silver, beads, glassware, dried dates and figs, and all kinds of manufactured goods. After gold, slaves were the next most important export of the Sudan, to North Africa, and since the 15th century also to the Portuguese. Most of the slaves were probably captured in raiding expeditions on the loosely organized people beyond the borders of the Sudanese kingdoms, often referred to in an Arabic source as lemlem. Among other exported goods were spices, cola nuts, shea butter, hides, civet musk, ivory, etc. The organization of trans-Saharan trade began in North Africa towns of Telsum, Fez, Sizomasa, Wangala, and others. All these towns are inland at different distances from the coast. Although they traded with Europe, they tried to avoid the participation of European traders in trans-Saharan trade itself. Nevertheless, at least two Europeans succeeded in getting beyond the Maghreb. In 1469, you had Florentine Bendito D. He's reported to have reached Timbuktu, while in 1447 you have Genome Melfanti, who stayed for some time at Tuat. Tuat was then an important commercial center where traders from Tunis and Egypt came to change goods for the Sudanese gold. Important to note is the Jewish presence communities in North Africa and the Saharan oases such as Tuat also took part in the trans-Saharan trade. The best description of this journey of a caravan across the Sahara is one of Batuta, who recounted his own experience. He described the dangers of the caravan facing the desert and the need for effective organization and qualified guide. For a long time, and since the 10th century, the Musafa Berbers were famous as guides to the caravans. Other Berber tribes of the Sahara also had vested interest in the trade, not at least through levying tribute but for protection. That is, for refraining from attacking the caravans. In spite of occasional attacks, Saharan Berbers and necessary measures of security prevailed. Conditions along the western route leading Walata changed in the second half of the 14th century, with the arrival of the Arab nomads in the western Sahara. Banu Sulayman began to start raiding caravans, and in his route had to be abandoned for more eastern itinerary, which brought the caravans to the region of Timbuktu. This was another reason for the decline of Walata and the growth of Timbuktu at that period. The Tariq el-Fattāsh assessment of 1591 in appropriating the lenses of religion reveals an acute awareness of certain social transformations. Why was the power of Songhay ruined and their unity shattered by God, so that they were overtaken by that which they derived as not possible? It was because of their neglecting the laws of God, the wickedness of slaves, and the haughtiness of arrogance of pride. During the days of Askia Ishak, guile had reached the limits of moral depravity and the display of atrocious and reprehensible sins, spreading such filth until adulterers practiced openly, having created a unique drum by which they would call Utaka Kuma to another one. And there were other such acts too disgraceful to mention by a virtuous narrator. We belong to God, and to Him we must return. Only 8 years following the death of Askia Daoud, Songhay was finished, an unfathomable development on the order of cataclysmic. Beyond moral turpitude, the analysis makes two critical points. The first concerns the consequences of the pursuit of self-interest. The civil war that led to the Balamas Muhammad had been encouraged by the ineffective tenures of Askia el-Hajj Muhammad Bani, in a term emanating for sibling rivalries that have reached new lows. Even without a Moroccan invasion, the empire may have been irreparably crippled. The second point concerns the wickedness of slaves, whose high profile is on full display at the Kambara farmer Alu, and again following the death of Askia Muhammad Bani. They arguably came to constitute the most important of stakeholders, benefiting from while contributing to the dysfunction of the Askias. El-Saidi critique also makes the point that the technical resources for Songhay's crushing defeat are less important than the factors underlying its weakened condition. The intensification of plantation slavery under Daoud, a possible response to famine, would have also been highly disruptive of the social fabric, as increasing numbers were recruited to labor other farms. As such, social insecurity and political instability would have been mutually reinforcing. Less than 10 years following the death of Askia Daoud, second only to Askia al-Muhammad, an accomplished and renowned imperial, Songhay lay in utter ruin, never more to rise. The carnage that followed Daoud's reign, largely a consequence of a challenged succession process, simply could not be managed by an empowered, servile elite. This time, trans-regional developments would intervene at a movement of higher vulnerability. This time, there would be no recovery. It is time now that we return to our subject, the biography of the Askias. We have dwelled upon the various personages, following a path that deviated a little bit, but clearly gave you an explanation of the historical perspective of the Songhay Empire. Moving forward, we will dive into the Askias who ruled, and we will begin with the dynasty of the Shis. Up first would be Shi Ali. Stay tuned. The next episode of the Masi Warrior Clan YouTube channel, we will deal specifically with the Shis, and then we will proceed forward, ending with the Askias.